All right, hello everyone. Hi, my name is Igor Pessoa from the Delft University of Technology. Thank you for attending our Urban Thinker Campus today with the title The New Urban Normal, um, Urban Sustainability and Resilience Post-COVID-19. So we are based here in the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and this event is organized by Bouwkunde, which is the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment, and the Global Urban Lab in partnership with the World Urban Campaign of the UN Habitat platform, who is trying to promote the implementation of the new urban agenda. So just for your information, we're going to record this session and we're going to make it available in the Global Urban Lab website. And just for your information, we're going to put the link of the World Urban Campaign in the chat box. So you can follow or click there and just follow and get more information about the campaign. Yes, well, so that is also putting the slides. The Urban Technical Campus are an instrumental platform for stakeholders to get together to make decisions about implementation of the new urban agenda. And on the 17th of June, we had our first session of the series about cities in the Global South with guests from Kerala, São Paulo, Minsk, and Santiago. And on the 24th of June, we had a second session during which we discussed the Green New Deal in Europe and the UK and how to build a better back. So you can also find the link to both sessions in our chat box. This Urban Thinker Campus event has been organized with the Global Lab, as I said, which is a communication and action platform, which is part of the TUDELF initiative. And our goal is to bring visibility and articulation to TUDELF doing work on urbanization in the Global South, or well, since we have struggled to find a better term for it. So next to hosting discussion, lectures, and events, the Global Lab predominantly wants to connect and build knowledge and serve as a platform throughout all faculty, schools, and departments for researchers and practitioners to meet, learn, collaborate in a transdisciplinary manner. So you can find the videos from the previous two sessions in the Global Lab website that we have in our chat box now. So I'm gonna give the floor to Caroline Newton, who will introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Igor. So this is the second UTC that is actually organized by the TU Delft. The first TU Delft UTC was organized in 2017 and was titled Education for the City We Need. The link for the results of that you can also find in the chat box. Now, our speakers for today are Julio Davila, Director of the Bartlett's Development Planning Unit, Caroline Skinner, Director of Urban Research at WIGO and Senior Researcher at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, Esther Karanya, Architecture student at the Technical University of Kenya, and Temitope Ogunbamila and Tengo Dikio, members of the Nigerian Slum or Informal Settlements Federation media team in Lagos and Port Harcourt. Now, I will be introducing each of the speakers with a bit more detail before their presentation. And the general organization of the event is done by Anja van der Watt. So thank you very much. So now for the first speaker, Julio Davila, the director of the Bartlett's Development Planning Unit, will start by questioning the assumed link between rapid urbanization and the emergence of zoonotic diseases, and try to enrich the debate by including the effects of structural drivers such as poverty and inequality and their spatial embeddedness. So Julio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Good afternoon to everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you to Igor and Caroline and the colleagues for inviting me to this. I am going to share my screen. This is research which, very exciting research, but I feel a bit nervous because it's such a complex set of scientific findings that I don't think anybody, certainly not me, is qualified to share this. This comes out of a 5-year project, probably longer actually, because we asked for a no cost extension, led by the University of Liverpool, Professor Eric Fevre and Professor Mark Woolhouse, who have been in the news quite a lot in this country as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak, or pandemic rather. This is funded by a consortium of UK research agencies, including the Medical Research Council. And it's called Epidemiology, Ecology and Socioeconomics of Disease Emergence in Nairobi. And essentially it was a very enlightened research done about, research funding. About 8 years ago, they decided, look, there's a number of diseases that are emerging. We know very little about them. We've seen their effects like SARS and Ebola and so on. Let's find out more about how they arise and essentially how do they distribute, reproduce themselves and settle in human populations in cities. Now it's very complex. It's a hugely complex process and we've seen the effects of it with the pandemic. What I'm briefly referring to here, and I don't have a lot of time, but is the publication that Caroline kindly saw and invited us to do. I think Sohail Ahmed, who is the first author, would have been a bit better prepared than me to do this. So I'll try and do credit to what is effectively a huge collective effort at putting this together. And the paper is available for free in Environment and Urbanization, and there's a project website there to go. So actually what we did was to look at scanning the literature for the last 20 or 30 years, looking at a number of keywords from epidemiology, from urban planning, from urban agriculture, and so on, and came up with quite a large, vast set of publications. And of course, most of them came from the biology, sort of medical sciences or vet sciences, more so than the urban planning side of things. What we were looking at was the background to zoonotic diseases and how do they correspond, going parallel with urbanization, particularly rapid urbanization in developing countries. We discovered, I knew nothing about zoonotic diseases until I was approached by this fantastic team of people. These are diseases that are transmitted between vertebrate animals and humans. It's a term coined by Virchow in the middle of the 19th century. And examples are very familiar now to us. SARS, avian influenza, Ebola, and of course, COVID-19 is the latest one and probably the most disruptive, or for sure the most disruptive in 100 years. WHO estimates that about 61% of all human diseases are zoonotic in origin. So it's not a passing fad. It's not a small problem. It's a major, major problem that we're facing. And of course, we're seeing it with this. So this work that we did was quite timely in many ways, because to understand the origin of these, but also to understand the effects of these, you need quite a lot of disciplines to work together. And that's because the zoonoses represent 26% of the infectious disease burden, if you measured it in what the epidemiologists call the disability adjusted life years in developing countries, whereas it's only 0.7%, less than 1% in developed countries. So we went through a number of publications, as I said, and found that the first driver of this is, of course, poverty and relative disadvantage. These expose people to multiple disease burdens, and it's true for zoonotic diseases. And this is manifested within cities through limited access to infrastructure services such as water supply and sanitation. When people under COVID-19 are asked to wash their hands, we know that it's very difficult for people who don't have access to clean water, or it's very expensive to have that delivered. So the urbanization side of things acquires a particular dimension. Or when people live in poor, dense, congested physical environments, which means that the diseases, and so we talk about a double disadvantage there. So the poor are definitely more susceptible to outbreaks. So when the literature talks about the urban advantage, in fact, it's shedding or moving aside the reality that within cities there's much greater inequalities between cities and rural areas. these are known zoonoses or neglected. Some of them are known, like COVID-19. It was unknown until probably January this year, or maybe December. We don't know. And by the way, all of you would have read in the media, because it's had quite a lot of coverage. This is believed to have come, although it's not for certain, from bats that infected pangolins in probably on the way to Wuhan market, or maybe some people say somewhere else in China, or even outside China. There's a big dispute about that. But essentially, we didn't acquire directly from bats. The bats infected pangolins because they were kept in very dense cages in places like the wet markets that in Wuhan, which was finally closed down as a result of this. So there's an important dimension there in terms of what do we do about these epidemiological or public health measures. But there is an overlap between these zoonoses and comorbidities. So in other words, other factors that induce diseases, with both non-communicable diseases, which are also on the rise, and multiple other forms of zoonoses like cholera and so on. It's likely to depend on different modes of consumption. For example, informal street vendors and poor practices, hygiene practices, can lead to that, and we found that very clearly in the case of Nairobi, which was a complex study, as I said. It can lead to short and hidden value chains. So the second driver is the movement of people, animal and animal source food products, which as meat consumption increases along with income everywhere around the world. Probably the opposite is happening in the rich world, in Europe and the US, but virtually everywhere else meat consumption is increasing, and therefore demand for meat, dairy products, or processed foods based on animal products is increasing. There is greater movement of animals and people across borders. There is greater than, therefore, potential for pathogens to move across borders or across between rural areas and urban areas. So rural and circular migrants bring pathogens, new pathogens to cities that have probably origins in rural wildlife settings, but also the migrants, temporary or more permanent migrants to urban areas, acquire pathogens that are dormant in cities and for which locals have immunity, and then take them back to rural areas. So it's quite a complex thing. And what we did, by the way, I forgot to say that, is we looked at E. coli, because it's a pathogen, it's not a virus. Viruses are horrendously difficult to study because they mutate and they transform, whereas E. coli is has very definite markers, genetically is very stable. So it's very easy to follow along very long chains of consumption. The third driver we found is that land use changes are definitely crucial for all this, in the sense that urbanization or urban sources of consumption are destroying more and more places of which have been untouched by human civilization, in inverted commas, disrupting ecosystems and creating all sorts of disarrays and chaos. For example, the bats that travel in several countries in Asia mainly, when their ecosystems were destroyed, and then infected fruit, these were fruit bats, infected fruits that were then consumed by humans, produced an early outbreak about 20 years ago. So Woolhausen, who was in our team, and another colleague back in 2005, identified 177 human pathogens as having come from land use changes and agricultural practices. So that rural-urban linkage is quite important in all this. Of course, the unplanned and uncontrolled urban growth and the expansion which converts natural and agricultural land to urban uses, or peri-urban or suburban uses, it's increasing. And we see that when, for example, in Nairobi, there's these connections, rapid connections between the central city or more dense areas to more outlying areas, less dense, former farms, coffee farms especially, being adapted very quickly for human habitation. That has enormous impact, not only in local livelihoods, but also in the potential for zoonotic diseases to appear. So there's a habitat fragmentation. We're cutting into spaces which were not up to that point so heavily touched by human habitation. So that makes habitation on hazardous sites, for example, floodplains, very not suitable for living, and yet they are breeding grounds for disease. The next driver was the urban planning agricultural policies themselves. We have to remember that the roots of urban planning, and I'm an urban planner and civil engineer by background, the roots of modern urban planning lie in disease control in 19th century Europe. And then that got transferred to many countries around the world, in fact, the colonies and to former colonies as well. And yet there are a number of attempts to deal with these issues, but to a large extent, urban planning has lost its roots in that public health concern, which was mainly with cholera in European cities and North American cities. And yet what we're trying to do is try and rekindle that contact with its roots in many ways. The other dimension of it is urban agriculture, which is crucial for living in cities, particularly for the poor, and crucial for what's coming next. Self-sufficiency, the idea that climate change will wreck a lot of the food systems around the world, and there is a certain reluctance amongst urban planners to accept urban agriculture, and therefore it becomes sort of illegal, informal, and not controlled in many ways, which again is another source of potential pathogens, even zoonotic pathogens. And things like sewage water being used to irrigate crops, which has been widely documented, including other work that we've done on urban water and peri-urban and water and sanitation, is an important dimension. Finally, it's just to say that all these drivers have both spatial and urban and social dimensions. And I think I'll leave it at that, Caroline, because I think I've reached my limit. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, you reached the time, but I think it was a very good presentation to remind us about the complexity of what we are talking, and the sort of the layered that we need to have a really layered understanding of how to sort of try to deal with it in planning and in spatial interventions. So we are keeping the questions for the discussion. So I suggest that we go to the next speaker, who is Caroline Skinner, the Director of Urban Research at WIGO and Senior Researcher at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And she will discuss some important lessons that we need to take away from the current crisis with regards to the informal economy and the need to provide space for this informal economy. So Caroline, the floor is yours. Do you wish to share your screen, or shall I?
Right. I'll share my screen, and could I just request for those of us who have dodgy bandwidth that we could maybe turn off screens, because our videos, because I haven't been able to hear a few of the inputs so far.
Okay.
But I'm going to share my screen, and I'm not going to show you my bad hairstyle, everybody, but also for bandwidth purposes. Okay, can everybody see?
Yes, perfect.
Caroline, can you just confirm the slideshow? Okay, great. So as mentioned, I'm based at the African Center for Cities, and I work also for the Action Research Network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. So I'm a researcher, but there's also lots of membership-based organizations of workers who are part of our network. So we have activities and partners in over 90 countries. I've only been given 10 minutes, and I'm going to try and stick to that. So although, as you can imagine, our work has completely focused on nothing but COVID and monitoring particularly impacts on informal workers, and also government responses and uptake from informal workers for some of the support measures that have been put in place. And we've done this in a very detailed way. But there is a, so I'll direct you to that at the end. So in terms of the big picture, we as WIGO have worked very closely with the International Labour Organization over the years for country comparable stats, and the calculations are that 2 billion people, or 61% of the world's workers, are informally employed. And measures to curb, there is widespread recognition that measures to curb the spread of COVID to have impacted particularly negatively on the informal workers. And it's partly because their jobs are precarious and they lack the legal and particularly social protections that otherwise kind of cushion people in these times of crisis. So the ILO itself estimated that 1.6 billion informal workers of the 2 billion have been significantly impacted by lockdown measures, and or are working in the hardest hit sectors. And certainly our, fine grain, what we're hearing from the ground completely confirms this. There's been a particularly negative impact for women. So women predominate certain segments within the informal economy. We have been working on some nationally representative data that will, the report's going to be released tomorrow in South Africa, and it again confirms that this has a very gendered dimension, as we can predict. So earnings, the first month of the crisis, a decline in informal worker earnings of 60% globally. And because in this, we're focusing particularly on Africa, the ILO highlights that it's likely to be the largest expected decline at 81%. We know now that in most contexts, the lockdown is somewhat of an easing. And so, the hope is that earnings will have restarted, but there are definitely concerns with the lack of demand. On the poverty front, so loss of incomes in the informal economy, one set of authors has suggested that it will jeopardize 3 decades of progress in human development. Some are saying even more. And there's a particular dimension around food insecurity. So more than 250 million people are estimated by the FAO to suffer acute hunger in 2020. And there's an interesting element here because we also know that informal distributors and producers are very critical to food security, and have often, in many contexts, and we've got a list of countries where this has happened, were not able to operate under lockdown despite this contribution. So on the positive side, cash grants. So a lot of you will have been monitoring. I mean, the World Bank is doing this very well. Cash transfers. So there has been a widespread response of cash of income grants. So the last record was 131 countries. So amounts are often low. I mean, we've been monitoring this quite closely, and informal workers' access is mixed in terms of whether they've actually been able to tap into this support measure. But this can be a basis for pulling informal workers into the social security net. There's a critical issue, and I'm sure many people have been, struck by this notion of what's important and what's now regarded as an essential service. So I think there's a new appreciation of informal workers' contribution to healthcare, transport, food distribution, and waste systems. If we hone in on the urban level, there's a very mixed picture. So key informal workers were declared essential service workers in some countries. So informal food vendors, informal transport, people in informal transport, and waste recyclers. But the health concerns have driven further evictions of slum dwellers, and there's a very close correlation between working informally and living informally. And informal workers, so for example, street and market vendors, again, Zimbabwe's been in the news around this, but there's many cases where this has been a concern. So the immediate priority is minimizing health risks. So I love this, and there's, we're really tracking examples globally of where there are interesting urban responses. And this is a street in Myanmar that has been converted into a market. We know that COVID is not spread as quickly if you're outside. So there are lots of advantages that informal workers have, but it does demand a kind of much more creative use of space and maximizing livelihood opportunities. So just to end off, in this relief and recovery phase, there are opportunities for transformation. So the recognition of informal workers and their contributions to city economies and societies has been at the forefront. The integration of informal workers into urban plans, so natural markets. Sorry, my screen is gone a bit fuzzy. And waste collection, recycling services of waste pickers. The extension of social protection, as I've mentioned, to informal workers. So this is a long-standing need, but also the inclusion of informal leaders into urban governance. So there's a long-standing call of saying we don't, as informal workers, don't just want to be meeting local authorities in times of crisis, but actually to have proactive platforms of engagement, regular meetings. The rallying call of many membership-based organizations of workers is nothing for us without us. But then again, on the negative side, there are threats of threat of negative reversals. So the permanent displacement from sites of work through evictions and privatization. We're seeing a lot of increased harassment and violence, and also the deepened discrimination and stigmatization. And then just finally, we're also seeing lots of interesting, innovative solutions from informal workers themselves. If it's around social distancing, around, creating their own wash station. It's important to work alongside them. And then. And again, sorry to have rushed through this. We are doing another Urban Thinkers Campus tomorrow, where you can hear, much more detail of the fine grain from particular cities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. So it's very nice that there is even a deepening of these findings tomorrow. So. For all of you who are interested, I would say definitely join tomorrow. And so now that we have zoomed in a bit more into everyday realities, we're going to zoom in even a little bit more. And Esther Karanya, who is studying architecture at the Technical University of Kenya, will speak from her experience in Nairobi. And Esther has a particular interest in the role of architecture and urban planning as a tool for social and economic progress in contemporary society. So Esther, the floor is yours, and I will share your presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Esther, as mentioned. I'd like to give a short presentation on the impact of COVID-19 in Kenyan cities, with a particular focus on Nairobi, the capital city. And I would also like to analyze the ways in which pre-existing living conditions have impacted the spread of the pandemic. All right, so I would like to start with why I'm focusing on Nairobi. Nairobi is Kenya's capital city, and of the 4 cities in Kenya, Nairobi hosts 63% of the urban population within the country. Also, since COVID first entered the country on 13th March, Nairobi has consistently had about half of all the cases within the country. So this is clearly where the epicenter of the pandemic within the country. So one of the things that has been a huge contributing factor in preventing COVID-19 spread has been the ability to work from home. However, salaried and wage employees within the country make up about 48.4% of of the population. And of this, 3.3% are the only people who have salaries. So only 3.3% of the population is able to work from home. So this means a large percent of the population doesn't have that option at all. So that becomes a non-viable solution, especially in the face of COVID. Also, of Nairobi's 4.4 million residents, 60% live in informal settlements and slums. And these are characterized by overcrowding, shortage, or outright lack of essential infrastructure, poor housing, shortage of healthcare facilities, poor sanitation facilities, lack of access to good nutrition, among others. So these have proven to be optimal conditions for the spread of COVID-19. So this is 6 out of 10 of Nairobi's residents are vulnerable to spread of COVID-19. Just for context, by the way, as Kenya is struggling with a 48.4% wage and salaried employees as part of the population, the US has about 93.8%. So in countries like the US, it's possible to implement stay-at-home measures. In Kenya, there was actually a debate about it, and people decided it's impossible to do it. People would have died of starvation. So I would like to look at this from 3 perspectives, because even within Nairobi, the experience of COVID-19 has been largely different for different individuals. So this is very heavily dependent on where people live, the conditions under which they live. So I would like to look at this from 3 different perspectives. So slums and low-income settlements, middle-income settlements, and high-income settlements, and how all those pre-existing conditions have affected the spread of COVID-19 or have otherwise insulated the residents against the spread. So to begin with, slums, I would like to take a specific look at Kibera. So Kibera is Nairobi's biggest slum, and it's home to 170,000 people. This is a really large number. So housing in Kibera is substandard at best. Healthcare is scarce and of poor quality when available. Water drainage and supply systems are non-existent, making hygiene and sanitation extremely poor. The economic conditions of the residents are poor, so they have no access to good nutrition, and mortality rates are high. And this is before a pandemic. So I have worked in Kibera, and the houses are quite literally timber frame and mud. And it gets so bad sometimes that people have to prop up the walls of their houses using trash to prevent them from caving in. So drainage and sanitation are non-existent, quite literally non-existent. It's water runs wherever it runs. Toilets are flying toilets, which are exactly what they sound like. People shower there, I think, thrice or 4 times a week if you're lucky, because a shower will cost you about 10 shillings. Most of these people make 50 to 100 shillings a day. So in the face of COVID and the whole, you have to wash your hands for 20 seconds often during a day, this has been really fairly impossible in places like Kibera, where people cannot even afford showers on a weekly basis. However, we've been very, very lucky in slums, because to fill these existing gaps, organizations such as UNICEF and SHOFCO have come in and provided interventions, which have been very, very successful in preventing the spread of COVID-19. So at the very beginning of the pandemic in Kenya, there was a realization that should COVID enter slums, the impact would be completely devastating. So NGOs came in very, very quickly and set up especially hand washing stations, which have been very successful, because other interventions are fairly impossible. Social distancing is impossible. It's an extremely crowded residential area. Masks and PPE is impossible because that requires money to buy, and they really can't afford it. So most of the interventions that have been put in place by NGOs have been towards hand washing and provision of mobile medical healthcare services. So there's also been food and cash relief to slum dwellers. And I think these few measures have been very, very effective in keeping the residents from the harsher realities of COVID-19. And one such marker, which is probably not a very good example, but I saw an interview a couple of weeks ago where some residents of Kibera did not believe that there was COVID-19. And someone said, I will believe there is COVID-19 when someone dies in front of me. And it wasn't just one person. There were a bunch of people who just generally do not believe that COVID is a thing that exists. And I think the fact that they can afford this kind of ignorance is a huge marker that the effects of COVID within slums have not been as devastating as they could possibly have been. Moving on to middle income areas, these surprisingly have been worse hit than slum areas in Nairobi. So middle income areas have infrastructure. So they have access to water, they have fairly okay housing, they have access to sanitation facilities, good nutrition and healthcare. But the problem with middle income areas is the infrastructure is just adequate. So in the face of COVID-19, everything snapped, like everything ran out. Water ran out, electricity, I think people went for days without any power. The fact that they're fairly poorly planned became a problem because overcrowding and social distancing do not really go hand in hand. So there's also another factor that has led to middle income areas being so hardly hit is because there have been almost zero interventions in middle income areas. So in slums, people realized there was going to be a problem and people came in and helped. But in middle income areas, people were pretty much left to their devices. And when the infrastructure broke down, people became completely vulnerable. Of the cases within the country, there's a graph of cases within the country, and then cases in Nairobi and cases within slums in Nairobi. So of the cases within the country, cases in Nairobi make up about half of that. So Nairobi is probably the worst hit part of Kenya, because this is collectively in Kenya, Nairobi makes up half, and this is on a daily basis. Every day, cases in Nairobi make up consistently about half the cases within the country. However, cases in slums make up a very small proportion of cases within Nairobi, which means most of the cases within Nairobi consist of cases from middle income areas, which goes further to show how big a disadvantage they've been at due to the just adequate infrastructure. Moving on to high income areas. Now, high income areas have been the least affected, even when in close proximity to some of the areas which have been hardest hit. Now, Karen, for example, is one of the most affluent residential areas within the city. It is bordered almost immediately by Kibera, which is the largest slum in the city. And this is not an isolated case. Nairobi has a sort of tendency to do that with the residential areas. So you have a completely affluent, rich neighborhood bordered immediately. Like you can see it from the slum by a slum, because the people who work in this high income areas, especially residential ones, need to be able to walk to and from work, so they live very close by. So there is pockets of slums right next to, or even sometimes within high income areas. However, the impact in high income areas has gone largely unfelt, because I think, for example, in Karen, there were about 5 cases at the very beginning of the pandemic, and those were people who were coming in from abroad, and then nothing after that. And in the high income areas where there have been consistent cases, it's largely been a factor of negligence of the residents rather than a lack of access to any sort of infrastructure. So people, for example, will go to a house party and one of the people is infected, and out of that springs about 15 cases. So high income areas are very, very well insulated against spread of COVID, and also the other indirect impacts that come with that spread. So building back better. I think building back better for developing countries needs to be looked at differently than it does for developed countries. So in developing countries like Kenya, for example, we're still dealing with like bottom of the pyramid problems, like very, very basic problems. We don't have water, we don't have drainage, we don't have food. You know, we're dealing with very, very basic issues compared to more developed countries where the conversation is now around transition to green economies and circular economies and things like that. So in developing countries, I think we need to handle the more basic problems and very, very quickly so that we can move up to the more complex issues without spending too many decades in between those solutions. So at the very bottom, I think, first of all, the funding and budgets around problem solution in developing countries are low. So we have low funding, so which means we have to come up with solutions that are more innovative and cheaper than what we've currently been doing. Because if, say, we have a budget of X amount of money and we're trying to provide housing for 2 families, we need to find a way to do 4 houses for 4 families with the same X amount of money. And there are solutions for all of these things, but we just need to, I suppose, integrate younger people who have more innovative ideas into the industry and provide more innovative, more high impact solutions. So one of the problems, by the way, which was, I think, extremely ironical to me, is at some point, I think a month into the pandemic, the Nairobi Water and Sanitation Company came out and said, we're unable to provide water for Nairobi's residents because there are too many people staying at home, or I think water use, something like that. But then at the exact same time when they were making that announcement, it was raining outside. So, I mean, the irony of that is astounding. So I think we need, first of all, to figure out how to diversify water supply sources to bridge the existing gap between supply and demand. Also within this whole, because water has proven to be an extremely indispensable resource, especially when it comes to fighting a pandemic. So we need to create recycling systems for essential resources such as water. We need to create elaborate drainage systems in low-income areas to improve sanitation. Also, we need to figure out alternatives for low-income housing to reduce slum upgrading projects, but they've largely been unsuccessful. So once we figure out this, also we need to figure out how to protect small and medium enterprises, because as the evidence shows, most Kenyans are not salaried employees. So if the larger part of the population is business owners, and these are small business owners, and there needs to be a way to insulate them against harsher economic times. And once we've figured out these small, rather low rung problems, then we can move up to things like low carbon, transition to low carbon climate, resilient growth, and investment in development of circular economies. And this needs to be done in as short.
Are you almost there? Because otherwise we're going to run out of time.
Oh, sorry. It's my last slide.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. So yeah, I think all of these solutions need to be put into consideration for the future. Yes. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Esther. So I see that there are already some questions coming in the chat, which is really nice. So we're going to cluster them all at the end. So now I would like to give the floor to Temitope Ogunbamila and Tenko Dioku, who are members of the Nigerian Slum Informal Settlements Federation's media team in Lagos and Port Harcourt, and they will present the grassroots experience of the pandemic. The stories you will not see on the news, as they put it on the website very nicely, because the everyday experiences during the lockdown and the different ways people have been trying to look after and provide for themselves and their community members are important to share. And so now you also already see on the slides the website that you can visit, and I will put the link also in the chat. So Temitope and Tenko, the floor is yours.
Hi, Um, Good afternoon from this side. My name is Ogunbamla Temtokwe, and I'm a member of the Nigerian Slum and Informal Settlement Federation. The Nigerian Slum and Informal Settlement Federation is a movement of the urban poor for our dignity and development. And the movement is supported by Justice and Empowerment Initiative, JEI. And in this movement, we have a media team called the Nigerian Federation Media for Change. And the reason why this um, team was created is the team is made up of young youth from slum communities in Nigeria. And the reason why it was created was because of the perceptions and narratives people have about slum communities in Nigeria. Like if you ask any high or middle class in Nigeria, okay, can you tell me about the slum in Nigeria? You hear them saying some kind of, okay, those guys are full of bad eggs. Most of them are touts, most of them are thugs, most of them are kidnappers and all sorts of them. But if you really think about it, I'm from an informal settlement in Nigeria. Thank God is from an informal settlement in Nigeria, and other youth media teams are from an informal settlement in Nigeria. And we are not out. I'm not a criminal, if you can see. So I'm working, do you understand? So those perceptions are what we want to change through our media. And one other thing is that people like if you look at the media houses in Nigeria, if they want to tell stories about slum communities in Nigeria, you hear them like they kind of censor what they project and report on because they don't want to. Nobody wants to get on the bad side of the government, so they kind of censor it and they don't give the right report. They don't give the right information to the world. So the team was created. Federation Media for Change was created so that we can change those narratives and perceptions, so that we can tell our own stories by ourselves, because we don't want other people to tell our stories. Even telling our stories is more better, because we can connect with other people like the way I'm doing right now. So the and we've been telling our stories in these platforms, and where we've been telling our stories through videos, pictures, and we've been doing exhibitions and community screening. We have a collection of photos, pictures on Instagram. You can check it out on Instagram, Legends of Lagos, and from Port Harcourt, Humans of PH, Humans of Port Harcourt. So you can check it out on Instagram, Legends of Lagos and Humans of PH. We have so many collections of stories on that page, and you see people from slum communities, very hardworking people trying to earn a living, and some guys are now selling nonsense about them. So we've been able to tell stories through our pictures and videos. We have collections of stories, and one of them is our Lagos Our Story. You have so many videos on YouTube. You can check out the YouTube page. We have our right to education, and other eviction stories and livelihood stories. And majorly we focus on eviction, livelihood, waterfront, and street trading. Then very importantly, people living with disability, because they are really not included in the policy, like the government policy. They think, oh, these people, because they're even the ones that are supposed to be included in government policies, but due to the way Nigerian government is, they've not been including them in the policy. So we tell stories about people living with disability. And Vagabond is there. Vagabond, what's up? All right. So we've been doing so different exhibitions. You see our exhibitions at Freedom Park. We go to Freedom Park and showcase our pictures, and face-to-face interaction with people and telling them stories about these people. And one of the title of the exhibition we did at Freedom Park was Displacement and Dignity, because at that time we were having a court case with the government, because they evicted so many slum communities at that time, and one of them is Otodogbame. So we just telling stories about these people, and how they've been living and how they are living now, which is a very bad way of living, because Nobody should live that way, actually. So we've been doing community screening because it's one thing to get stories from people living in community, and it's another thing for them to say, okay, yes, this is my story. Do you understand? For them to be able to say, okay, yes, this is my story. So we go to community, so people in the community also see their own stories, and they are strengthening, they stand in solidarity, so that anything the government wants to do, we support each other, and make sure we stand with each other, basically. So moving on, the media team has also been working on so many things, and I've mentioned some of it. And one other thing is we've been working on a feature film which is called The Legend of Vagabond Queen, and it's about a young single mother who stumbled upon a corrupt like a corrupt money, and trying to change the narrative of everything I've been talking about of slum communities, and trying to support the community. And the really main kind of theme of the film is like, okay, yes, slum communities, if we support each other, money is not really everything. Money is not really everything. If we support each other, we can win the case, like kind of solidarity and making sure we support each other and put an end to forced eviction in Nigeria. So one of the things we will be talking about this evening is the Corona Diary, and my colleague from Port Harcourt, Tengo Dikio, will be talking about that. Thank you very much.
Good evening from this side. Hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
My name is Tango Dikio. I'll be talking on the Corona Diaries. First of all, what is Corona Diaries? For us, Corona Diaries is a story hunting project that tells the impact of COVID-19 on the urban poor, that tells the impact of COVID-19 on our slum communities. These stories cannot be told, or will not, you will not see these stories out in the mainstream media, because even if they do, they will not tell the story the way it looks like, or they will not tell the real perspective of the story. The Corona Diary stories, what we basically do, we tell stories from different perspectives, such as my colleague rightly said, we focus on people living with disabilities. We focus more on the impact of COVID-19 on livelihood. We focus on the impact of COVID-19 on education. We focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. And also focus on the impact of COVID-19 on how police, how would I say, how the Nigerian police have used the pandemic as an avenue to extort the urban poor. Few weeks ago, my colleague was extorted from some amount of money because she was not putting on a nose mask. These are more stories we talked about. Why do we do what we do, or why do we start taking stories of COVID-19, or why do we do Corona Diaries? The reason why we do this, as I said earlier, because we want to tell our own story the way it looks like. We want to tell our own stories ourselves. The stories will not be told by, so someone else will not tell our stories for us, because nobody will tell the story the way it looks like if we don't tell our story. I think that's one of the major reasons why we do the Corona Diaries project. And basically, the big picture of Corona Diaries, starting from we started Corona Diaries from, I think, in March this year, and we were able to gather over 70-something stories from across Port Harcourt and Lagos. These stories are impact of COVID-19 on our waterfront communities and our slum communities. Who are the people taking these stories, or who are the people doing this Corona Diaries project? The people who reside or who live at informal settlement or slum communities who have been affected by COVID-19. That the people who tells the story themselves, because nobody will tell the story for them. They took the bull by the horn to tell the stories by themselves. And we have also we have also told so many stories, because as day goes by, things are being difficult. We see a story of a disabled person who is being extorted by the rich, or you see a story of a girl who is being extorted. Different kinds of stories is being told through Corona Diaries. As I said earlier, these stories cannot be. You will never see these stories on the mainstream media. Never will you see stories on the mainstream media. Even if you see these stories, they will just tell you one perspective of the story. My colleague rightly said, they will always tell you the wrong part of our communities, or the wrong part of the stories. They will never tell the other part of the story. And that's the reason why we do Corona Diaries. I'll leave it on my colleague Temi to do a wrap up.
All right.
I think we lost the connection.
So there is a story I worked on recently, and how this has really affected them. I think at the beginning of the lockdown, people living with disability, they are disabled, they can't go out, and the palliative the government have been promising to give to people has not even reached them. So there are different kinds of complaints, and it is really bad because these people are the most vulnerable people in the community and society. So there has been different stories also. There is a story of Mr. Reed. Like if you really go to the Corona page, you see everything, and he's a disabled, and he's still working. Like he's doing this cab business. Like he takes people around like transportation, and he has been complaining bitterly also that he needs help. This people are, even they still try to. There's this uptick on the street, but due to this pandemic and everything, and you can't go out that much. There is lockdown in the states, but now it has been relaxed. So he usually sell handkerchiefs, but now it's not really moving, and for him to feed is really a problem. So you can check out the Corona.
Hi, Juliana. We can't hear you.
Stories. It's there on.
Oh, okay. Have you finished, Temitope?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, no, the line was a bit bad in the end, but so thank you very much. I think we had a nice overview going from sort of the big complexity of these zoonotic diseases to the reality in the field, in our real lives. So Roberto, do you want to make a quick wrap up and then go to the questions?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Hi, everyone. My name is Roberto. I'm also working at the Delft University of Technology. Thank you so much for being here. As I said in the chat box, if you want to tell us where you are listening to us from, that actually helps us with our report. Later on, we can tell people how many countries were there. So today we had a very interesting overview of going from the zoonotic diseases, why are we having more zoonotic diseases, what they are and what produces them, from Julio, to the impacts of these diseases in the informal workers of the world, which, as we know, are the majority of the workers of the world. And that's very, very, very significant, because I have the feeling that most policy around the world is made for those of us who are in the formal world, who have salaries or who are registered workers, and policymakers around the world, they tend to forget about the non-registered people, but they are the majority, and they contribute, as Caroline pointed out, very, very much to economies and to livelihoods and to our cities. And finally, we had an in-depth understanding of how urban fragmentation and urban inequality affect the how people experience and contract COVID-19, which is super nice to hear from our friend uh, from Nairobi. And finally, we got the experience from the ground of people who are, as they say, are trying to give their story. And I think that's very, very powerful what you're doing, because nobody can tell your story for you, right? People will always misunderstand and bias. And I think it's very powerful that you are trying to tell your story by yourselves. So I will start with some questions. But my first question goes to our two last speakers. Can you tell us a little bit how are you funded? How do you go about this super important work? Where do you find the funds to do all this? If you want to unmute yourselves.
Okay. First speaking. We are a member of a broader group. Like, we have our headquarters in SCI, Slum Dwellers International, and the headquarters is in South Africa. And Slum Dwellers International is made up of 36 countries, which Nigeria is part of. So we receive grants from them. And our supporting NGO, Justice and Empowerment Initiative, also fund seek for funds from people out there that want to support our project. And people seeing our project too, if they see what we are doing and the excellent what we are doing, they also fund the project. So we're receiving grants and funds from people.
Maybe you can just quickly go to the questions from the audience. I have here a question from Rosemary Guignard. Maybe Rosemary, if you want to, do you want to speak? You can unmute yourself.
Yes. Hello, everyone. So I was really taken by the similarity between what's going on in Nairobi and what's going on in Port-au-Prince. And I have my question with Esther is that for us, we feel that there's been some manipulation with the numbers of COVID cases in Port-au-Prince. It's the same trends also in Haiti, that we see that there's a lot of cases in middle class, but we tied it with people who are traveling. So these are imported cases. But the question about the slum in Haiti, there's been some significant undercounting. People are not going into the slum. People are not talking about the stories in the slums. So I wanted to know from you, how is it? Are your numbers reliable?
Hi, Rosemary. I would say I think so. I can't be absolutely sure, but from what we're seeing, especially because the sample sizes have been fairly small up until now. We're currently at about 6,000 samples per 24 hours, and we've been steadily climbing over time. But from what we've seen in on the media, a lot of testing is being done in slums. And another thing that I think might contribute to the data being a bit more accurate is that testing in the slums is free. So people are just queuing and then getting free testing. However, we can't speak to absolute certainty that the cases being tested in the slums are the same as those being tested everywhere else, because there is no information being given about that. All that's being produced by the Ministry of Health is the number of cases in each respective area, not the number of samples tested in each respective area. So I would like to say, from what we are seeing in the media, they might be close to accurate, but there is really no way to be absolutely certain. I hope that answers your question.
Oh yes, I think the staying in the slum, being free, is a major incentive.
Major achievement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question. Caroline, would you like to lead the questions? Caroline.
Okay, sure, yes.
Go on.
Okay, there's a second question from Victor. So Victor, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask the question and maybe give some context. Victor?
Hello, my question goes to Esther. So Esther, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Victor.
Yeah, we talked about how the slum people in Nairobi have been suffering from the slum and during the pandemic, have been suffering from the pandemic. So I just want, has there been any intervention, like you mentioned there have been intervention from the UNICEF and stuff like that. Has there been any intervention from the government to help people in the slum? Has there been any intervention? And if there has been, how do you go about it? What did you do?
Sorry? Sorry, please repeat the last part of your question.
I said, has there been any intervention from the government, and how did you go about it? Did you form a collaboration or stuff like that?
Okay, I still can't hear you so clearly, but I think I had seen you write your question in the chat room, and I think your question is how to verify whether the interventions have been successful. Hello, Victor?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, that is the question, Esther. How can you be sure about the effectiveness of the intervention?
Of the interventions.
Yes.
Okay, you really can't. That's actually probably the most accurate answer. Now, again, as with testing, what we have, all the information that we have coming out of slums is not statistical. It's from what we're seeing in the media. So we have almost zero documentation of the number of cases and the number of interventions that are, and how effective they've been by percentages or things like that. So all our information currently is coming from news outlets, and I think one of the most I would say, not honest necessarily, but one of the most grassroots channels that I have seen is a YouTube channel called, I think, Kibera News, which has been documenting actual experiences, same as the guys from Nigeria, actual experiences on the ground of the interventions taking place. And this is where we're getting all our information. Now, the problem in Kenya is that things are not really very well documented. So to say that we have statistical proof that this and this is happening would be misleading information. So what we're getting is from what we're seeing on the news and on the media and on YouTube and from residents themselves. So I could, I suppose, liaise with an organization and see if I can find some sort of statistical on the ground information, but I think it's probably very difficult to get our hands on actual studies because people rarely ever do any statistical data collection. Yes.
I have a question.
Thank you very much. Okay, Roberto.
Since we are here, please, guys, send in your questions. We are having a little bit of difficulty to hear people. The connection is not optimal. But my question is to Julio, actually. You drew this historical background of planning that was initially rooted in disease control and public health, and I wonder if you are observing any movements to go back to that, or if there are any ideas about including ideas of healthcare and health in urban planning again?
Thank you, Roberto. Very, very interesting question. Yes, this is what we're trying to do. Because I've been working on public health or with public health professionals for the last 10 years, and I've realized that you know the roots of what we do lie precisely in public health. And of course, right now in the rich world, the issues have more to do with non-communicable diseases, people not doing enough exercise, eating too much or eating too badly. And therefore, you know, what can you do in terms of urban design? Caroline is an urban designer. In terms of urban planning measures, in terms of sort of policies to incentivize the co-benefits of transportation, which essentially walk, cycle, and do active travel. So that's something that we've been working on for the last 10 years or so. And in addition to the old problems that have been mentioned, which have to do with water and sanitation and the infectious diseases that lie therein. So, you know, developing country cities are now in that coexistence of old diseases, infectious diseases, and new modern lifestyle diseases, which have to do with eating too much, eating too badly, and not doing enough exercise or movement. And so that's where planning has come into force in the last few years, and I've been working on things like that with colleagues. But that takes me to another issue, which is, and I saw it really absent in all the discussions, and I felt it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you all for contributing with your comments and your perspectives. It was very, very enriching, enlightening. But I feel that one dimension has been missing very seriously here, and that is transport and mobility. And you know, what the stories that Esther was telling us about Kibera, I'm with the person who asked about figures. I think there's a serious issue of under-reporting, but also there's another, perhaps even more worrying or equally worrying dimension, which is why transmission of the disease is not happening might have to do with the fact that people are not moving. And you know, in our work on mobility, poverty, and urban planning, what we've come to realize, not only us but several people who worked on this, is that the least you move, either you are extremely rich or very well endowed in many ways, for example, with a decent formal job, as Roberto was saying, with good internet connections. So those of us who can actually stay in our study rooms and work, that's fine, we're fine. But you know, that's a tiny proportion of the population. It's 45% only in the UK. I don't think it's much higher in much of Europe. And it's much, much lower in the cities that we're talking about here. So either you're very privileged because you've got all these endowments, or you're extremely poor. And what happens is, to get out of poverty, you need to move. You need to trade. You need to sell your labor force. You need to go and acquire training. Your kids need to go to school. You need to go and get health services. And these are rarely decentralized in a way that they're local. So the absence of mobility or transport in these discussions, and particularly Esther, when you were showing your different options, which some of them were interesting, but I didn't feel that they really were COVID-19 specific. They were very generic. Yeah, it's fine to do recycling. It's fine to think of a circular economy. I don't know how they specifically deal with COVID-19. The big absentee there was transport. And transport is where, you know, I've been working on transport for 10 years, maybe more, maybe 15 years. Transport and cities, particularly the social dimensions of transport, more than the environmental dimensions. Having been trained as a civil engineer, I'm interested in the movement, but also in the social dimensions of how people move. And that's crucial, because if you look at public transport systems in London, the underground ground to a halt, literally, and now it carries only about 15% of the capacity. And the same goes in Latin America, which have not fantastic, but decent mass transit systems. Transmilenio in Bogota cannot go above 35% because the infection rate might go up. So not being able to move is disastrous. And that's where we have to think, and that's where the next inflection of a curve is. How do we get people to move and interact again? Because as Caroline was saying, the vast majority of people in cities, depending on which regions you're talking about, have to move, have to trade, have to go to physically to places to perceive an income. I mean, the cash transfer systems, which she mentioned, have been a lifeline. Even in the US, the cash transfer systems have left a lot of the poor people in the US better off whilst they exist. But, you know, come after the election, Trump is going to cut that, or whoever comes is going to cut that, and they're going to be back to being poor again. So moving is crucial in all this. That's all I wanted to say, Rocco. Sorry, Roberto, sorry for taking so much time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Can I elaborate a bit on that? Because what I would like to ask you, Julio and Caroline, is you mentioned it. Planning is a very important element and something that we will need to reconsider in the future, as we have done in the past. But then, how do you include this issue of mobility, but also how do you include the need for still, as Caroline showed in her examples, the need for innovation bottom up and the need for appropriation of spaces in a way that maybe wasn't designed by us planners. So I find that a very difficult struggle between the need for some formalization to ensure for example, say mobility, but also the need for bottom-up innovation and freedom of appropriation.
Caroline, do you want to go for it? But I've spoken too long.
No, you're giving me the hard one. So, you know, it's a very tricky one. I mean, you know, there's a central kind of tension, but and maybe just to give a vignette of what I'm seeing, you know, we track very closely where there might be positive examples, and there's lovely work in the inner city of Durban where a whole lot of trader organizations and in other informal worker organizations have been working alongside some urban planners to really kind of come up with bottom-up solutions. So in their case, they're finding that the city is a little bit at sea about what to do around minimizing health risks. And in fact, the traders themselves have come up with lovely solutions of kind of, you know, making wash stands using, you know, old Coke bottles and bits of wood and really kind of, and social distancing. So working out, you know, how the space needs to be reconfigured, and has been with some kind of, you know, nice professional input, has then been able to present back to the council to say, you know, please, these are the priorities. You know, you need to open up the toilets. I mean, many of the toilets were closed when people most need water. But also, you know, this is what we bring to the table. Can we meet much more regularly and kind of come out? So I do think that there are these kind of pockets that we're finding, and certainly a WeGo approach or theory of change is to say that you work alongside worker-based movements, and there really is innovation coming from there. So, you know, I think it's a very dark period. I mean, I think we're all feeling that very profoundly, but there are these opportunities to kind of push for something quite new and different, and certainly the bottom up way is where things have worked historically, but it does require some political commitment, and honestly we're in also quite a dark period politically, so that there's all the more need for a strong civil society to kind of, you know, chart a different course. But enough from me.
I really agree about the strong civil society that these kind of organizations that we need. So I see we have a couple more minutes left. Are there some other questions?
I just wanted to chip in this debate, if I may, just very quickly. If I may, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
So for me, I see this irreconcilable clash between the need to empower people who are in informality. They are the majority of people, and empower grassroots and empower And as you say, Caroline, to let people appropriate spaces, and the issue of citizens' rights, right? How do states and governments operate in order to provide the minimum and also the non-minimum services that every citizen should be entitled to? So I really struggle to, because of course, this is purely theoretical, right? We know that this is what states and governments should be doing, but they are not. So what should we do? Shouldn't we believe that that government should provide things? For me, it's a big debate in my head, to be honest. I don't know if I made any sense, but anyway.
So is there someone who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, I can respond to Roberta's question a bit. This is Kweku from Ghana, but I'm in the US. So kind of, I think Roberta's question is kind of a social spatial connection, in that for the case of Ghana, for example, when we had the lockdown for about a month, the government had to step in to provide, basically fulfill the social resilience to keep the informal communities and citizens afloat. And so they would provide meals for the families. So I think they provided almost 2 million. That was the count. And then for, I think, the spatial element, it's basically the urbanists of whatever countries you are in the global north or global south, coming together to find ways in which we can reconfigure how we are actually beginning to live and work, and how we can kind of support density but not overcrowding, because overcrowding is a way that the transmission also goes overboard. And then kind of like also incorporating elements of the private sectors, the ones who, the wealthy citizens, inducing them and incentivizing them to provide and support the government efforts to help people, especially in times of crises, I think. So it's just kind of really incorporating and integrating all of these elements. I think that's a way we can begin to look at and solve not just short-term incidents, but also begin to look at it long term.
Thank you so much, Kweku. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Okay, good. I think we have had very interesting presentations and a very good discussion. I suggest that we are going to close the session. I really want to thank the speakers and all the participants for being here, for the interesting stories, the relevant stories and presentations. And so I invite you all to check out the Global Urban Lab website, where there will be a link to to this session and to the other sessions, and to the report as well, I think, afterwards. So thank you all very much, and